Welcome to the Clarin Horatio Daily World Brief, which you can always find at clarinhoratio.com. It is Wednesday, July 29th, 2026. And today's briefing is focused on a global architecture that is under severe localized strain. We're looking at an environment where government institutions are either violently asserting control across physical and digital borders, or just failing completely to protect citizens from environmental realities. And we need to begin immediately with a hard military escalation in the Middle East. Earlier this week, U.S. and Saudi fighter jets executed a series of strikes across eastern Iraq.
Yeah, and they specifically hit multiple targets associated with the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the PMF, which are Iran-backed militias. Those strikes killed at least 20 fighters and wounded dozens more across the Baghdad, Nineveh, and Basra provinces. And U.S. Central Command is stating that this was a direct military response to, a sequence of hostile actions directed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Right, because the IRGC launched aerial drone attacks targeting Saudi energy infrastructure on Monday and Tuesday, alongside missile strikes directed at a U.S. military base in Jordan. But adding another layer of friction to this whole regional architecture, Iran's naval forces concurrently struck 3 commercial oil tankers navigating the Strait of Hormuz. They claimed those vessels ignored explicit warnings and sailed an illegal route.
Which is a claim that has immediate global economic ramifications. Because if you're watching household budgets or managing a logistics supply chain, the public consequence of this friction is just inescapable. Following these military strikes, the global benchmark Brent crude oil spiked to nearly $87.70 a barrel. And the Strait of Hormuz has essentially been closed to normal, unescorted commercial transit since late February 2026. When vital maritime arteries are blockaded like that and sovereign energy infrastructure is repeatedly targeted by drones, that instability translates directly into higher global fuel costs. It creates sustained inflationary pressure across multiple economies. But I have to ask about the framing here, because U.S. Central Command characterized Iran's missile strikes on the U.S. base in Jordan as an attempted surprise attack.
Yeah, and evaluating the sequence of events over the past several months really challenges that narrative. We're looking at the prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the coordinated drone strikes on Saudi facilities in Riyadh, and the methodical targeting of commercial tankers. That pattern doesn't resemble a sudden, unexpected ambush at all. It looks like a highly calculated, steady strangulation of global energy shipping routes.
So Tehran is methodically establishing a persistent physical blockade. And those civic and geopolitical stakes within Iraq itself make the situation remarkably volatile. Because the PMF, they're frequently discussed as though they're this rogue, independent militia operating in the shadows of the Iraqi state. But that is structurally inaccurate, isn't it?
It's entirely inaccurate. The PMS is an umbrella organization that was formally integrated into the Iraqi armed forces by parliamentary decree. So by executing lethal airstrikes against PMF headquarters on Iraqi soil, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are technically bombarding official state security institutions.
Which forces massive, unavoidable questions about Iraqi sovereignty and, frankly, the long-term viability of the U.S. military presence in the region. Washington is attempting to execute retaliatory strikes to establish deterrence against Iran, but the mechanism of that retaliation involves pulling the host nation's official military apparatus directly into the crossfire.
Exactly. You cannot separate the PMF from the Iraqi state on paper, which means every single strike against them destabilizes the diplomatic foundation of the U.S. forces stationed there. And shifting focus from the execution of these military strikes abroad, we really must examine the intelligence apparatus directing them from Washington, D.C.
Right, because the U.S. Senate just narrowly confirmed Jay Clayton as the new Director of National Intelligence by a vote of 51 to 47. Clayton is replacing the acting DNI, Bill Pult, whose brief tenure generated intense institutional whiplash. Pult used his concurrent role as a federal housing regulator to refer domestic political opponents for potential prosecution, which is just wild.
It is. And before exiting the office, Pult actually boasted on the social platform X about executing a 5th round of terminations. He ultimately slashed intelligence staff by 30% in just a matter of weeks. So installing Jay Clayton represents a profound pivot in operational background for the intelligence community.
Because Clayton is a former securities regulator and a federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. His career is defined by overseeing complex financial cases and drug trafficking prosecutions. Most notably, the federal case against former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Placing a financial prosecutor in charge of a sprawling, highly classified global espionage apparatus overnight is a jarring transition.
It's an incredibly jarring transition. He inherits an agency currently reeling from intense domestic politicization, severe staffing deficits engineered by his predecessor, and just overall internal operational chaos.
To put that in perspective for listeners, pulling a financial prosecutor into the D&I role is roughly equivalent to asking a corporate tax attorney to run a specialized SWAT team. They both deal with enforcing rules, but the mechanics, the stakes, and the operational tempo are fundamentally different. Senate Democrats initially viewed Clayton as a slightly more conventional choice than Pulte, but his confirmation hearings exposed the deep partisan crossfire that's paralyzing the intelligence community right now.
Yeah, lawmakers repeatedly grilled Clayton on whether he acknowledged the outcome of the 2020 election. And he carefully navigated the traps, stating only that the winner had been, quote, certified. But the urgency driving Clayton's confirmation through the Senate is heavily tied to a highly contentious legislative battle. The Trump administration considers the reauthorization of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to be a top institutional priority.
And just to clarify, Section 702 is that specific, powerful provision that allows the U.S. government to collect the digital communications of foreigners located abroad without obtaining an individual warrant from a judge, correct?
That's right. And because global digital traffic often routes through U.S. servers, this database inevitably sweeps up massive amounts of communications belonging to American citizens. Senator Mark Warner openly expressed serious reservations during the hearings about whether Clayton possesses the institutional fortitude to withstand intense political pressure from the executive branch on this.
Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader John Thune explicitly stated that confirming Clayton should serve as a signal for lawmakers to stop blocking the FISA reauthorization. So Clayton is clearly being positioned as a stabilizing bureaucratic force, meant to secure this vital surveillance authority, even as the intelligence community's leadership remains completely entangled in domestic political loyalty tests.
Well, while governments clash over digital surveillance architectures and military deterrence, there is a relentless physical environmental threat forcing mass displacement and causing hidden fatalities across the globe right now. Spain is currently battling the largest wildfire in its recorded history at Burgahondo, which is located west of Madrid.
And the scale of that is terrifying. The blaze has ravaged over 108,000 acres and forced the evacuation of 40,000 people. I read that the thermal intensity of this fire is so severe that firefighters are observing pyrocumulonimbus clouds. Those are literal fire-generated thunderstorms, where the extreme heat forces ash and smoke high into the atmosphere, creating localized weather systems that can generate lightning and further ignite the dry landscape.
It's apocalyptic. And in neighboring France, the crisis is equally visible. Authorities have evacuated 220,000 people from the southwest coast as temperatures hit 41 degrees Celsius, so that's about 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The state is deploying special mitigation measures just to protect defense and aerospace manufacturing sites from the encroaching flames. The scale of the climate crisis in Europe is highly visible, and it is met with massive, proactive state mobilization.
Right, like how the European Union is currently in the process of purchasing its own permanent continent-wide firefighting fleet to manage these increasingly extreme fire seasons. But for more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, you can always visit clarinarratio.com. I want to contrast that highly visible crisis and state response in Europe with the hidden, lethal reality unfolding simultaneously in India.
Yeah, you have to consider the specific tragedy of Pali Mahalakshmi, a 50-year-old woman in the rural village of Busapadra. She died of heat stroke while digging a water reservoir in 40 degrees Celsius heat. She was working under a government employment scheme for a daily wage of just 180 rupees, which translates to roughly $1.89.
That's devastating. Facing a household burdened by a disabled son and crushing debt, she essentially had no alternative but to perform grueling manual labor in direct sunlight without shade or adequate hydration. Treating extreme heat deaths the way the Indian government currently does is like experiencing a devastating coastal hurricane where the state simply refuses to count the citizens who drowned.
That's an apt comparison because, unlike a flood or a structural collapse, lethal heat stroke leaves no single visible physical marker on the landscape. We really need to understand the physiological mechanism here. As a person's core body temperature rises and severe dehydration sets in, the body loses its ability to cool itself through sweating.
And that cascades rapidly into multiple organ failure or a fatal heart attack. If left untreated in its advanced stages, heat stroke carries an 80% mortality rate. Because it lacks a dramatic physical signature, there are no collapsed buildings or flooded streets. It allows institutions to easily ignore the casualties. Hospitals and local governments routinely record these deaths under vague chronic causes, such as cardiac arrest, rather than acknowledging the environmental trigger that actually killed the patient.
And the systemic governance failure in India regarding this threat is just staggering. Official state data claims there were only 84 heat-related deaths nationwide throughout 2025. That official number defies basic statistical reality.
Especially considering a recent report published by researchers at UC Berkeley, which estimates that extreme heat could be causing approximately 3,400 excess deaths per day across India during these peak heat waves. And the researchers explicitly noted they were deliberately blocked by the Indian government when attempting to obtain comprehensive countrywide mortality data.
Right, and with 90% of India's workforce operating in the informal sector, so we're talking about farmers, construction laborers, and street vendors, the state's act of obfuscation of the danger represents a catastrophic civic failure. They are failing to protect their most vulnerable citizens from a highly predictable, lethal threat.
But the Indian government demonstrates immense capability when it chooses to mobilize state resources. It's just that those resources are currently directed toward suppressing inconvenient domestic realities. Authorities are actively cracking down on the youth protests that dominated the national discourse over the summer. The youth-led Cockroach Janta Party, or CJP, began as a satirical internet collective, but it rapidly morphed into massive street demonstrations.
Demonstrations driven by profound frustration over institutional failures, severe youth unemployment, and widespread leaks of state civil service exams. And in response to the civic unrest, the Intelligence Fusion and Strategic Operations Unit of the Delhi Police is cinematically filing criminal first information reports against individual protesters.
Concurrently, the government is issuing formal legal notices, demanding the social media platform X immediately delete posts and videos criticizing Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The state apparatus is tracking down users and threatening actual jail time for publishing an internet post expressing political frustration, which brings up a deeply surreal juxtaposition.
Because while the police suppress digital dissent, government lawmakers are deliberately deploying Gen Z internet slang in the lower house of parliament. They're using this vocabulary to mock the political opposition and attempt to appeal to the very youth demographic they are simultaneously arresting.
It's incredibly cynical. During parliamentary debates over an anti-exam leak bill, members of the ruling coalition frequently use terms like delulu, which is internet shorthand for being delusional or detached from reality, as well as FOMO and clock it. Bansuri Swaraj of the ruling party actually declared the prime minister had clocked it by introducing the legislation, while another member of parliament accused the opposition benches of being delulu.
Imagine a massive corporate entity trying to sell products to teenagers by awkwardly using outdated internet slang while simultaneously employing private security to arrest those same teenagers outside the store. A political movement organized entirely on WhatsApp and Instagram, fueled by memes and digital vlogs, has completely reshaped the formal lexicon of one of India's oldest institutions.
And the Supreme Court has already had to intervene in this crackdown, ordering authorities to release minors who were arrested during the CJP rallies and barring coercive action against citizens whose digital data was surveilled by the state. The government desires the cultural currency and aesthetic energy of the youth movement, but entirely rejects any of the associated accountability.
As digital anthropologist Payal Arora notes regarding this situation, language is always the first thing politics borrows when trying to connect with a new, disruptive constituency. Utilizing internet slang in parliament operates as a completely superficial mask. It does absolutely nothing to address the structural demands of a generation facing severe economic exclusion, massive unemployment, and failing educational systems.
It's a modernized authoritarian tactic. Co-opt the vocabulary of the rebellion to create the illusion of representation, while using state security to crush the actual dissent. And speaking of state security, the friction between technological control, national security, and domestic labor markets is aggressively reshaping Western industries this week as well.
Yes, the Trump administration has officially banned new foreign-made humanoid and advanced robots from being imported into the United States. This executive move explicitly targets China's rapidly developing robotics sector. Alongside this, the Federal Communications Commission formally banned Chinese power inverters,
which are critical, highly complex devices used extensively in modern data centers and residential solar panel installations. The FCC cited severe national security risks, warning that these specific devices could allow foreign government actors to turn them off remotely, steal domestic data, or facilitate widespread access and surveillance through a coordinated cyber attack.
The FCC's decision places these power inverters on the covered list, legally classifying them as unacceptable risks to U.S. infrastructure. To understand the gravity of this, you really have to understand how a power inverter functions. It is essentially the brain of a modern electrical setup, converting direct current generated by solar panels or batteries into the alternating current required by the broader power grid.
Maintaining a highly skeptical stance on autonomous machines and grid components is necessary when evaluating these policies. The humanoid robots the administration is banning are not cartoonish sci-fi novelties. The FCC is correctly treating these advanced machines as highly mobile, remote-controlled surveillance devices, capable of mapping private spaces, gathering immense audiovisual data, and transmitting it across borders.
And regarding the power inverters, if a foreign actor compromises the software managing that DC to AC conversion, they can intentionally cascade failures across a local grid. We can observe the devastating real-world consequences of grid failures by looking at the ongoing nationwide blackout in Ghana.
Right, because early Wednesday morning, so as of July 29th, a major fault on their national power grid plunged the capital city, Accra, and multiple surrounding regions into total darkness. The outage paralyzed public transport, disabled digital financial services, and forced hospitals to rely on rapidly depleting backup generators. The situation in Ghana entirely validates the FCC's fear of compromised grid components.
If a cyber attack targets power inverters in the U.S., the resulting infrastructural paralysis would mirror the chaos currently unfolding in Accra. The economic and security threads dictating international trade are deeply intertwined here. We are watching the global hardware supply chain fracture along strict, uncompromising security lines.
The era of a seamless global village where consumer technology and grid infrastructure flowed unimpeded across international borders is decisively over. The United States is explicitly building massive legislative and regulatory walls to prevent Chinese robotics, artificial intelligence hardware, and grid infrastructure from infiltrating American daily life. Policymakers are prioritizing absolute domestic security over the availability of cheap, imported technology.
But while the U.S. fortifies its technological borders against Chinese hardware, the European auto industry is currently collapsing under the weight of Chinese electric vehicle competition. Germany's automotive sector has long served as a fundamental pillar of the European economy, but it is undergoing a brutal, rapid restructuring.
BMW is initiating a voluntary redundancy program designed to cut up to 8,000 office jobs by 2027. Volkswagen recently confirmed plans to slash up to 100,000 jobs across its workforce and close 4 major manufacturing factories. Porsche is also executing a severe restructuring, agreeing to cut 9,000 jobs by 2035.
This industrial collapse is driven by a 30% slump in European sales within the Chinese market, combined with the loss of crucial U.S. manufacturing subsidies. Europe is hemorrhaging tens of thousands of highly skilled, well-paying manufacturing jobs because legacy automakers fundamentally lost the technological transition to EVs.
They failed to secure their own battery supply chains and software development cycles early enough, which allowed Chinese competitors to flood the market with cheaper, highly advanced electric vehicles. The developments we're tracking today do not share a single neat theme, but rather demonstrate multiple distinct pressures moving in completely different directions.
Right. We observe states relying on physical blockades to choke the vital commercial waterways of the Middle East. Simultaneously, Western nations are erecting massive digital and regulatory firewalls against foreign robotics and grid infrastructure, while governments in Asia deploy police units to suppress domestic social media dissent. The baseline architecture of international trade and domestic governance is shifting dramatically.
Institutions are being forced to react to cascading crises that transcend traditional geographic borders, whether those threats manifest as state-backed cyber vulnerabilities embedded in residential solar panels, or a frustrated generation utilizing digital platforms to demand basic economic accountability. The mechanisms of state control are being tested constantly.
It forces an evaluation of exactly where governments choose to deploy their capabilities and where they choose to look the other way. The European Union can procure a fleet of firefighting aircraft to combat unprecedented wildfires, while the Indian government expends its resources arresting teenagers for internet posts rather than protecting rural workers from lethal heat waves.
That brings us to a final thought for you to mull over as we conclude today's briefing. If our complex governance institutions are struggling so profoundly to protect citizens from the undeniable physical realities of the climate, as we see with the lethal, uncounted heat waves sweeping through rural India and the historic fires displacing thousands in Europe, How equipped are they to protect society from the invisible, highly complex threats of compromised power grids, fractured supply chains, and autonomous machines? For those looking for slower, deeper context on the underlying mechanics of these geopolitical shifts, check out Debate Candy. And for more daily briefings and classic audiobooks, you can visit clarinoratio.com.